All right, our next dimension is power distance. Probably something most people haven't heard of. Nevertheless, an important value that national cultures around the world differ upon. Power distance is the extent to which members of society accept that power in institutions and organizations is distributed unequally. Now, we have to remember this doesn't have to do with whether there's a hierarchy, those on the top and those on the bottom. This has to do with whether you think the hierarchy is good or bad. Right? So high power distance cultures think that hierarchy is good. It's, the way things are, no problem. Low power distance cultures think the hierarchy is bad. We don't want inequality. Inequality is a bad thing, and we should do everything we can to minimize it. So the hierarchy exists. It's your value, your judgment about that hierarchy. So low power distance inequality should be minimized. Superiors and subordinates are people like me. So yes, there's power. Again, there are hierarchy in all societies, but low power distance societies don't like it. I have a picture there of the European Union and the way that they arrange their seats at the table, as it were, and you can see the circles are meant to suggest that every nation is represented and gets to participate. Of course, there's still a hierarchy there. Those towards the center, we assume, are in a position of greater access and influence than those on the margins, but nevertheless, some kind of sharing, a circle. High power distance represented by the caste system, for example. There are people on the top and people on the bottom, and everybody has their own place in this, and that's the way it is. In fact, it's good. We like it. People, subordinates and superiors are different from me. Power is a basic fact of life. Who cares about it, whether it's legitimate or not? It's the way things are, and the way things should be. Would be a high power distance perspective or viewpoint. Again, back to the book, some descriptions, manifestations of power distance, as I've just talked about. Small power distance, social relationships should be handled with care, for example. Less powerful people should be interdependent. Less powerful people in a high power distance society should be dependent upon those in power. Parents treat children as equal. Low power distance, high power distance. Parents teach children obedience. I'm in charge, and this is the way it is. So you can see some reflections there of this basic value dimension. With regard to political organization and business organizations, you can see some of the consequences. So decentralization in small power distance cultures, whereas centralization is very popular in large power distance. That allows for a few people in charge of the whole group, where decentralization tends to be a bit more democratic. Large salary gap in large power distance societies, small salary gap in small power distance societies. You take a look through some of these. Again, you don't need to know every single one of them, but you get the idea, and all of these should seem consistent with that main idea. So based on that short description, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. If you have any thoughts about which are the higher power distance cultures, where there's people on top and people on the bottom, and they're very different, and that's the way it should be, and that's the way we like it, and power is a fact of life, and get used to it. As I referred to the caste system, India tends to be a high power distance culture, but it didn't make our top 15 most recently. Malaysia is number 1. Slovakia, number 2, Guatemala, number 3. You can see there's no necessarily distinct pattern with regard to high power distance. We see it throughout the world, although you will notice the exception or the absence of European Anglo cultures. Again, as we'll see in a minute, it's connected with individualism and collectivism. But pretty much geographically, with the exception of Anglo-centric cultures, you see power distance spread throughout Asia, throughout the Americas, throughout the ex-Soviet Union. Different cultures taking up power as a relevant way of organizing, a good way of organizing. Low power distance cultures, again, the pattern to note is, again, individualist cultures. Anglo cultures are all represented in low power distance. And there is an important, significant correlation to talk about here between Anglo-European cultures and power distance. If you look at it around the world, it looks very similar to the individualism collectivism distribution. Again, because of that Anglo concentration in low power distance. Right before I get there, though, there's some interesting data with regard to, regardless of nation state, what your position in the organization is and what you think about power distance. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the lower you are in the organization, unskilled, semi-skilled clerical workers tend to be higher in power distance. They see the hierarchy and they respect it, as it were. They value it. Interestingly, the higher up you are, the less you think about observing the hierarchy. That's because you're on the top. You don't tend to see it, and this is a reflection we talk about in my course as well. The people in power don't see how power is exercised in the same way that people that are on the receiving end of that exercise in power. So we see professionals and managers tend to be not so respecting of the hierarchy. Now, of course, their opinion might be different if all the people below them weren't respecting the hierarchy, but I thought that was interesting, occupational difference with regard to power distance. The more significant pattern to note here is the connection between individualism and power distance, and that is that they're highly negatively correlated. That is, individualistic cultures tend to be low in power distance, whereas collectivistic cultures, as we see on this slide, tend to be high in power distance. You can see there's very few countries that are in the quadrant on the left-hand side. That is to say, low in power distance, yet high in collectivism. Costa Rica, Trinidad. They tend to be on the opposite end of the scale, high in collectivism, which would be towards the top, and high in power distance, which would be toward the right. So Guatemala is very representative of that, very collectivistic culture and a high power distance culture. And you can see most our collectivist countries, that is to the right of the line, are also, collectivistic countries north, above the line, are also high power distance countries to the right of the line. So collectivism and power distance. One of the explanations, again going to Confucius' roots as we did with collectivism, Confucius also was a high power distance philosopher. He said stability in society was based on unequal relationships. So as I say, again, Confucian philosophy lies at the root of many East Asian power distance practices. On the contrary, the flip side, they're negatively correlated, that is to say, the higher in power distance you are, the lower in collectivism, it would be the lower in power distance you are, the higher in individualism you are. That's a negative correlation. So individualist countries tend to be low in power distance. So we see individualist countries below the line, and we see low power distance countries to the left of the line. So again, all our Anglo-European cultures are represented here. Very few, or relatively few, cultures that are individualist are also high in power distance. Slovakia would be an exception there to some extent. Spain and Belgium tend to be a little more power distance. France as well tends to be a little higher in power distance, but there's that connection. And there's reasons for this connection, just as we see with Chinese philosophy and Confucianism connecting power distance and collectivism. We see Greek philosophy connecting individualism with low power distance. Plato recognized the basic need for equality among people, but at the same time defended a society led by an elite class. So there's a sort of contradiction built into most all Western democracies, or those who have inherited this Western culture, belief in equality, yet the practice of inequality. So I think it's best framed by, in our Constitution, all men are created equal. I just love that. Of course, at the time they meant all property-owning white men. But in that statement is this yearning for equality, this yearning for everybody to participate, yet there's also a reflection of the political and social reality that not everybody participated. So you see this tension, but nevertheless emphasizing low power distance or equality. And we'll come back to this connection between ancient Greece and ancient China. And when we discuss some other dimensions here in a minute, but I would refer you, while I'm thinking of it, to a book, wonderful book by Richard Nesbitt called The Geography of Thought: How Asians and Westerners Think Differently and Why. And he goes into a much richer history about how Greek philosophy developed and is different from Chinese philosophy, and then connecting that to modern psychological experiments about how people see and perceive the world, that he thinks is connected to those basic philosophical differences. Well, we see some of those philosophical differences here in cultural value dimensions. Okay, so that's power distance, low and high. Our third dimension is masculinity, femininity. Obviously, you've heard of masculine and feminine, probably didn't think it was a value dimension of culture, but it is in Hofstede's opinion. Now we have to remember, masculine and feminine are not value-free concepts, so what is referred here as masculine, it tends to be at least a Western European view of what is masculine and what is feminine, as we'll see reflected in these definitions. So masculinity stands for a preference in society for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material success, where femininity represents a preference for relationships, modesty, caring for the weak, and quality of life. While I'm describing quality of life and femininity, for those of you who have accessed this through the Intercultural Reader on my website, I refer you to the third listing there called The Mellings. Is an interview with my good friend Torsten Melling and his family, who are from Norway. Torsten was a foreign exchange student in our home back in date myself, back in 1985 and 86. And I talk with him and his children about what they see in American culture and what they think some of the similarities and differences are with their own culture. If you're taking Com 330, that's a required thing to listen to, and I would draw out that he does talk about this notion of quality of life that's reflected in femininity, and we'll see here Norway is very much a feminine culture. He talks about most people wanting to work 37 hours a week and having 5 holidays. Quality of life, you work to live, you work to have a certain quality of life, whereas masculine culture emphasizes you live to work, you live to do your job. And Torsten feels like a fish out of water in some respects. As a neurosurgeon, he's constantly working. And he gets a bit frustrated sometimes that, he's one of the rare people in his culture that's living to work instead of working to live. So he individually adopts a masculine cultural idea, at least in this respect, where the national culture emphasizes femininity. So check out that podcast, kind of interesting. Not only with regard to femininity, but he also talks about power distance as well that we just discussed. He talks about his kids having no respect. I know personally he doesn't talk about it in the podcast, but students having little respect for their teachers, no respect for authority, which would be a low power distance kind of thing. Teachers are not different from me. And he also talks about the hospital in which he works as a flat organization, flat meaning trying to minimize that power distance. So those observations about femininity and power distance to pick up on in that podcast for the purposes of an exam. So femininity, let's describe it more thoroughly. This dimension addresses the way in which society allocates social as opposed to biological roles to the sexes. Now, don't need to get into a bit of social construction, but obviously biology creates male and female. Society creates masculine and feminine. Obviously, male is supposed to overlap with masculine and female with feminine, but we can all cite examples in which those things don't overlap. And so masculinity and femininity has to do with how society judges that overlap. In a masculine society, we'll see here, masculine society, there should be a perfect correspondence. Men are masculine, women are feminine, and if you don't fit that, you're something wrong with you according to the culture. That's the judgment, that's the value. Where feminine cultures see that distribution a bit more fluidly. Yeah, men can be men, but men can be a lot feminine or a little feminine, and vice versa. And so it tends to be a much more fluid system of judgment about the allocation of social sex roles. So feminine cultures, the distribution is less clearly defined. In masculine culture, money and things orientation, live to work, as I already mentioned, macho, manliness, big and fast are the preferred qualities. Small and slow are preferred qualities in femininity. People orientation, unisex and androgyny ideals. You're probably getting a sense of the differences here. Some more descriptions of the differences. Welfare societies, feminine cultures are often called welfare society, help the needy, help those who need help. Masculine societies is sort of quote-unquote survival of the fittest, no matter that that expression is inappropriately used with regard to Darwin. Fit referred to fit between an organism and its environment, so there is no single fittest organism because it depends on the environment, but it's often used as fit, like physically fit, strongest, which can be a liability if you got to carry around all this mass. You're not going to make it to the end of the 100-mile marathon having muscle mass. But my little tangent aside, this notion of being strong is very a masculine notion. Aid, for poor countries, according to a feminine ideal, poor countries should help themselves. Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. All this is a very masculine orientation. So you can think generally the political rhetoric in the United States, the left, so-called left, taking a feminine cultural orientation, and the so-called right taking a masculine orientation. In the classroom, average student is the norm in a feminine society. Praise for weak students. You want to help everybody, succeed. Masculine orientation, just identify the best and, screw the rest. Might be, in the extreme case. So you can read through some of these, and I think you can understand how these value dimensions are manifest in each of these specific behaviors. So with regard to which countries are masculine and which countries are feminine, I've already mentioned Norway as being feminine, but this is a masculine scale. So we have highly masculine and low masculine, which is interpreted as feminine in Hofstede's discussion. So big and strong, macho, everybody pull yourself up, take care of yourself, may remind you of some cultures. Well, according to the most recent data, Slovakia is the most masculine country, and Japan, number 2, Hungary, Austria, Venezuela, Switzerland, Italy. Here we start to see the breakup of these Anglo norms we've seen in the previous two-dimension power distance and individual collectivism. The Anglo-European countries really hung together. In masculine and femininity, we see several countries here as being masculine: Austria, Switzerland, Ireland, Germany, Great Britain. And we'll see on the next slide that a number of Anglo countries are also highly feminine. So we don't have that block. Cultures differ in these ways. We see quite a spread then. We have Latin American countries, European countries, ex-Soviet countries, Asian countries, again, Middle Eastern, African countries. The omission is likely because there's just so few that participated here are on this list of 76. So low masculine countries, in other words, highly feminine country. There we see Norway is number 2, as it were, number 2 most feminine country behind Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Finland. As a block, we'll see in this discussion of masculinity and femininity, a very consistent block of feminine cultures. Beyond that, we see some ex-Soviet countries as well, and Thailand, famous for the sort of culture of ladyboys that might connect with this androgyny ideal, very different from Japan, which would be a very, very masculine culture, as just mentioned. If you want to look at this on a map and how it plays out, highly masculine cultures in red, and there's quite a distribution there. Highly feminine cultures in light, not necessarily highly feminine, but less feminine cultures. Again, quite a geographic distribution. So looking at some other recent data, the notion of performance versus welfare societies. How well do you take care of your kids is evidence of masculinity, femininity, where masculine countries don't, survival of the so-called fittest, don't really care per se. So on that basis, you could argue that Portugal, Austria, Hungary, United States, and Great Britain are masculine cultures in the sense that children's well-being doesn't fare very well. And if you were to look back at our list, Austria is our top 15, Hungary is our top 15, Great Britain is in our top 15. The United States, and I'd have to double check the book, the United States is like around between 15 and 20, so it's not a top 15, but that child welfare corresponds very nicely, very consistently with these masculine value ratings. And again, we see the block: Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland. Spain is the exception, but certainly that Nordic block of cultures being feminine and taking care of their kids. Connected, we see feminine cultures, less of a gender gap in economics. And so in 2007, global gender gap, we see at the top of the list Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland, feminine cultures, and have the least gap in terms of earnings of men and women. Masculine cultures, you can see on the list there, Mexico or Italy, which also Italy, for example, and Mexico, both highly masculine cultures, have a larger gap. And you can see other countries that weren't included in Hofstede's survey and get an idea, perhaps, of whether and to what extent they're either masculine or feminine. This research was updated in 2010. Similar results: Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden. U.S. is 19 in this survey. And then we see a bunch of countries, that, most of which aren't included in Hofstede's data. Again, we could surmise, at least on this dimension, or this manifestation, that they're masculine oriented. All right, that takes us through masculinity, femininity. And before I introduce the next dimension, I want you to have a listen to part of an episode, a great series called Radiolab. This is from Seeking Patterns.
In the mid-1970s,
A guy named Wolfram Schultz.
decided to take a much closer look, and his subject was a monkey.
So he would put these very thin needles that can record the activity of individual dopamine neurons in the monkey brain.
And they put the monkey in a room, and then every day they would walk down the hall to the room where the monkey was. They'd open the door.
Hello, monkey.
They'd flip on the light. They'd give the monkey some juice.
Here you go, monkey.
And then when the monkey sipped the juice, dopamine.
Happy monkey.
Right. But then comes a surprise.
He soon discovered something very odd about these neurons.
As they juiced this monkey day
Hello, monkey.
after day
Hello, monkey.
after day
Hello, monkey.
after day,
Hello, monkey.
the squirt of dopamine, which they were always measuring in the monkey's brain, seemed to move forward in time.
What do you mean?
Well, at first the dopamine hit when the monkey took the sip of juice.
Hello, monkey.
But after a while, the monkey got the dopamine hit when they entered the room and switched on the light.
Hello, monkey.
And then after a few more times, the dopamine hit when the researchers' feet could be heard walking down the hall. You see what's happening here?
Hello, monkey.
Not really? You're gonna have to bring it home for me.
Well, I'll do it again then. What the monkey is trying to do is piece together the sequence of events that inevitably lead to juice.
Exactly. That's what these cells do. They try to predict rewards.
Oh, so this isn't just about movement or about feeling good. It's about finding the pattern of the thing that makes you feel good.
Yeah.
It's pattern finding.
Oh, this is pure pattern recognition. This is essentially how your brain makes sense of reality. In some very primitive sense, it parses reality in terms of rewards. This is how you get more food in the wild, is you can see the reward before anyone else can.
How you get more food in the wild. You see the reward before anybody else can. So what the heck does this have to process of trying to recognize what happened next. Dopamine neurons constantly generate patterns based on experience, if this, then that. So the monkey, learned to connect, the sounds of the researcher coming in with the arrival of food. And so we're trying to predict what happens, and if everything goes according to plan, then a little burst of enjoyment, I feel good, like I know what's going to happen. If not, right, so when you heard that gunshot, when you weren't expecting it, your dopamine neurons didn't predict that, they probably sent out a signal announcing their mistake, like, whoops, what's happened? And so within milliseconds, the anxiety of the brain is inflated into a powerful emotion, anxiety. So maybe you experience that a little bit based on your inability to expect that gunshot sound. Now, of course, if I told you that gunshot sound was going to occur, you wouldn't have been surprised and it wouldn't make you feel anxious. But chances are, just for a few seconds, you felt a bit of anxiety based on it being unexpected. So in this understanding of our human physiology, we have to understand that certainty is rewarding. It's pleasurable to know what's going to happen. And uncertainty creates anxiety. When I have something happen to me that I didn't expect, I'm a little bit off put. So one orientation of cultures is towards this, to maximize certainty and minimize uncertainty. And I have a big and there, because one of my things, if you're one of my students, I like to talk about adding without contradiction, individualism and collectivism, is that, certainty can be rewarding and uncertainty can create anxiety. And, there's the contrary. There's instances where certainty is boring. Like, I want to know what's going to happen, but only within a certain degree. I also like certain kinds of surprises.
Well, there's a thing that happens with sensation seeking, habituation. Habituation is a basic law of learning, the lowest organisms. When you expose them to something repeatedly, over and over, they respond less to it. They're less aroused by it, even though initially it was arousing. When they get used to it, and nothing happens, nothing particular happens, they get less aroused.
And uncertainty can be anxiety-provoking. So what do you do about uncertainty? Well, that is the answer provided by our next dimension of culture, uncertainty avoidance. What position does your society take with regard to uncertainty? And there's two basic positions. Either uncertainty is rewarding and you like it and you embrace it and you accept it and you cultivate it. Or, again, in this either or, you choose one or the other. In Hofstede's logic, uncertainty is unlikable, makes me nervous, makes me anxious, it's not desirable, don't do it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to feel it. So uncertainty avoidance then is your culture's answer to this question of judgment about uncertainty. The future is necessarily unknown. Do you try to control it or you let it happen? So basically we have high uncertainty avoidance or strong uncertainty avoidance cultures that view uncertainty through the lens of anxiety. I don't like uncertainty, and I'm going to do everything I can to manage it. So you have lots of rules, codes of belief, order, right? If everything can be ordered and predictable, then I can manage whatever uncertainty arises. these cultures foster a belief in the truth, capital T truth. There is a single truth, because if I believe in a single truth, then that helps me with regard to certainty. It helps me feel less uncertain, because I don't like uncertainty. I want to avoid uncertainty. That's why it's a strong or high uncertainty avoidance culture. On the other hand, low uncertainty avoidance cultures take the lens or root of uncertainty as pleasurable. So I like uncertainty and I want to embrace it, right? Tolerate the unusual, prize initiative, more willing to take risks and break rules, foster belief in relative truths. So I don't know what's going to happen, and that's okay. I kind of go with it. And, I've got my truth, but then you've got your truth, and it's all okay. We'll see that diverse societies tend to be low uncertainty avoidance societies, because that diversity brings uncertainty, and you manage it, you live with it. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So again, low uncertainty avoidance cultures see uncertainty through the lens of pleasure. So deviance is not threatening, more acceptance of dissent. High uncertainty avoidance cultures see uncertainty through the lens of anxiety. Therefore, deviant persons and ideas are dangerous, and there's a strong need for consensus. Some additional descriptions. Hofstede et al. Refer to them as strong and weak, high or low. So weak or low uncertainty avoidance, low stress and low anxiety, because uncertainty is pleasurable. It's normal, right? Comfortable with ambiguous situations, whereas high or strong uncertainty avoidance cultures, high stress, high anxiety, aggressions and emotions may be vented. Acceptance of familiar is fear of ambiguous situations. Some other descriptors in terms of organizational context, what uncertainty avoidance looks like. Some more changes in employer, shorter service, because there's no risk, there's no fear of moving from job to job. Strong uncertainty avoidance cultures like to, work for the same company. That's what's preferred or ideal. That's why you minimize uncertainty that way. A work hard only when needed in a weak uncertainty avoidance culture. Emotional need to be busy and an inner urge to work hard. So the idea is that you're, manifesting your, controlling your anxiety by working hard and organizing everything. Third slide here, more ethnic tolerance, which I spoke of earlier, and weak uncertainty avoidance, more ethnic prejudice in strong or high uncertainty avoidance. You see some descriptions about religious differences in commandments and nationalism and refugees or immigrants. You might predict these positions based on understanding the dimension of uncertainty avoidance. So, again, you might think of cultures or societies that would rank high or strong in an uncertainty avoidance value dimension. Those cultures that have rules and have organization and don't like immigrants, by and large. Greece is number one. Portugal, Malta, Guatemala, Uruguay, and a lot of ex-Soviet countries as well: Russia, Poland, Serbia, Romania, Slovenia, Japan. You got all the geographic representation here in terms of high or strong uncertainty avoidance cultures. Many students are surprised that Greece is number one, because they have this image of tourism in Greece, this image of relaxing by the beautiful blue Mediterranean, where stresses are few and far between. Perhaps the more recent, this is 2012, economic crises in Greece kind of might highlight the ways in which Greece could be a high uncertainty avoidance culture. I'll speak to this pattern and the historical foundation of this, Greece in particular being a high uncertainty avoidance culture, in a second. Low or weak uncertainty avoidance cultures, we see the U.S. there in the top 15, as it were. Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam, China, particularly in the case of Hong Kong and Singapore, East Asian countries that are ethnically and linguistically diverse. Sweden, Denmark, Jamaica, that probably fits our images of relax and low stress culture, and in this instance they are a low uncertainty avoidance culture. Great Britain, Ireland, the United States. So interesting findings here with regard to uncertainty avoidance. You can see how this is represented geographically. Again, quite a spread. We have Asian, European, America, Americas, across the Americas, countries that are high uncertainty or strong uncertainty avoidance cultures. The explanation that Hofstede et al. Give with regard to this, again, traces back to this fundamental difference, philosophical difference between Eastern and Western cultures. Hofstede argues that, again, it's our thought, our manner of thought, and the way that we organize ourselves in Western culture. They talk about the Roman Empire, which, of course, the Romans were greatly influenced by the Greeks. So the extent to which the Roman organization and Romance language culture is responsible for high uncertainty avoidance, because if you go back, Portugal, Malta, Belgium were high uncertainty avoidance cultures, which are all Romance language cultures. And then Greece being the source of many facets of Roman culture, we see the connection. And the connection, Hofstede argues, is the organization and the way in which laws were understood and executed. So in the Roman case, there were codified laws. It was about the law. Whereas in the Chinese case, and again we see a number of Asian cultures as also being influenced by Confucianism, and Chinese culture being low in uncertainty avoidance. Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, China, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Singapore, all low or weak uncertainty avoidance cultures. And Hofstede argues that this is historically, of course, there's lots of factors that go into it, but one of the main threads is historically and culturally, Chinese administration of their empire was described as a government by man. It's much more pragmatic. You leave it up to people on the ground to figure out what's going to work. And so there can't be a strong uncertainty avoidance when you're constantly, working through those uncertainties. But there can be a strong uncertainty avoidance or high uncertainty avoidance when, you have this law and it's whatever this law says. Don't give me the pragmatics of working it out with this person. I want the law to tell me what to do. And that law and that reliance on rules and systems and organizations, as opposed to the lived pragmatic working out, is a difference between Western Romance language cultures and Chinese East Asian cultures, which helps explain some of this variance in uncertainty avoidance, and a pattern for those of you in Com 330 that you should know for the test. All right, turning to our last dimension of culture. Hofstede in the book actually has a sixth dimension, but I'm not going to present that here. It's sort of newly developed and pretty nascent, and I don't think necessarily worth our time at this point. Maybe I'll introduce it in a couple years. But the last dimension that we'll talk about for the purposes of this lecture is long-term orientation. Now, this is still a relatively new dimension of culture with regard to the research. It was added after Michael Bond did his Chinese value survey, and it's come up more recently in the past few decades than initially. Wasn't part of the original dimensions. It's a sort of tricky dimension to understand. It's kind of subtle, and it kind of refers back to what I was just discussing earlier, the sort of pragmatics of Chinese culture. Now, don't be confused by the title. Long-term orientation versus short-term orientation doesn't mean those societies that respect tradition and those that don't. It's a bit more subtle. There's some element of that. But in some ways, it's the short-term oriented cultures that respect tradition a bit more. I'll explain how that works. According to Hofstede, long-term versus short-term can be interpreted as dealing with society's search for virtue, their position about good and evil. Not truth, which is the question discussed earlier, but virtue. What is good and what is evil, and how do you determine that? So LTO, long-term oriented cultures, believe less in universal guidelines. So this kind of connects up a little bit with uncertainty avoidance that we just talked about. And instead emphasize the consideration of time and circumstance. So pragmatics, what is good and evil depends on judging things in context, whereas short-term oriented cultures believe that there are absolutes to this. So again, we'll see that connection with Chinese culture, Confucianism, and long-term orientation because of that pragmatic emphasis. So the notion is if you persist, you do things in moderation, and have some sense of shame because it's the group that's going to keep you on the path of virtue, the path of good. You don't go crazy with one thing or another, alcohol, for example. You have to do things in moderation, but it's not like alcohol is all bad or all good. It's about engaging in a behavior in moderation. If you're trying to be virtuous, persisting in that, particularly with regard to work and education, you have to persist. Don't go crazy and study your brains out, but be persistent. Do it in moderation. Have a sense of shame. Allow yourself to be corrected, as it were, by the group, and then you will be on the side of virtue. That is how good is ultimately determined in a long-term oriented culture. Very pragmatic, on the ground, contextually based understanding of good or right. Short-term cultures are fatalistic and fundamentalistic, believe more in absolute guidelines. Emphasis is on immediate gratification and conspicuous consumption. So that gratification, conspicuous consumption, that's more clearly a short-term kind of orientation. But don't forget that it also is connected up with this notion of good and evil, and having a fundamentalist view about what is good and what is evil is consistent with a short-term oriented value system. So again, this value dimension is a bit more complex, but you can see some descriptions, additional descriptions. So pride comes up in short-term orientation. Tradition comes up in short-term orientation, which is a little bit, oxymoronic. Family pride, service to others. So there is some connection to community. It's not individualism. So service to others, but pride, tradition, conspicuous consumption, gratification. These seem to define short-term orientation. Long-term orientation, children should learn to save money and things, learn from other countries. So there is a connection to, not so much pride, but doing what's right, doing what's pragmatic, doing what makes sense. Flex-a-humble, Minikoff calls it, family pragmatism. This is sort of interesting. Daughter's ideas of beauties are independent of mother's ideas. So that's a long-term orientation because you learn from others. You look out in the community, you engage things in moderation, and you're influenced by things far and wide in terms of geography, but also in terms of time. Whereas a short-term orientation is, a bit more blinkered in that respect. Talent for applied things in a long-term culture, talent for a theoretical in a short-term. Economic growth is really where most of this data comes from. Fast economic growth of poor countries, slow or no economic growth of poor countries, Hofstede, and they tie it into savings rates and such. So that's why it's a kind of a bit of an odd dimension, but it does stick together and does cohere and does provide some understanding of cultural differences. So based on that description, I don't know if you have any idea about what cultures are long-term oriented. Well, I did give the clue about China and the influence of Confucianism. So we find long-term oriented South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and China. That's the obvious pattern. And then as well, a lot of ex-Soviet Union countries also show up with long-term orientation. And none of those countries, similarly, share any short-term orientation, low and long-term. So these are your short-term countries. Number one short-term would be Puerto Rico at the bottom of the list, Trinidad. A lot of Americas are short-term oriented. And then here we see the East African countries, as well as Middle Eastern countries. We see a number of them because you notice there's 93 countries on this survey. It was more recent data because this dimension, evolved or became clear more recently than previously. So we see the appearance there. It really has to do with economic development. And the thing to remember, so the long-term orientation map here actually doesn't correlate too much with the data because this map was made prior to the data that I just presented you with. The pattern to recognize here with regard to culture and long-term orientation explains some of the economic success of the, quote, East Asian dragons, East Asian nations that have had economic turnaround. Long-term orientation explains why some societies succeed better than others in moving from rags to riches, but not riches to more riches. There's a good correlation between long-term orientation, pulling yourself out of poverty to wealth, but not necessarily increasing your wealth once you have wealth. Whereas short-term oriented countries kind of tend to be mired in poverty, have lower savings rates, etc. Many African countries, the value of pride is emphasized and education de-emphasized. These are characteristics of short-term orientation. Thus, putting pride over practical results and expecting wisdom without education does not encourage working and studying today for reaping benefits tomorrow. So said Hofstede. So says Hofstede et al. In explaining some of the African development. Of course, the picture's got to be a lot more complex than your value orientation as to why some countries have developed economically and others haven't. But at least this is some way that culture may play a role in the development of nations around the world. So that ends our tour of 5 value dimensions of culture. And hopefully it gives you an appreciation of international cultural differences and similarities, and you have a better understanding of the world in which you live. Thanks very much.